being a branding and strategic planning geek, I have some of my favorite stories, and probably my most favorite story about goal setting is when Kennedy said, and I'm paraphrasing this, "We're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade." Um, this was an extraordinarily compelling goal, the kind that goes beyond, in some respects. And looking in hindsight, you could say, it's kind of amazing because you think about when a politician says something like that. It's just another promise that the politicians are making. But this is extraordinary in and of itself because he kept the promise. He set a goal and it was kept. And so you say to yourself, well, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Because here you have this sort of incredible, compelling goal, overarching goal. And we didn't really know how to do it. I mean, we knew we had the knowledge and we knew we had the skill, but we didn't necessarily have the full pathway of the full understanding of how we were going to reach the moon by the end of the decade. But what was amazing about it is as they went through this process, starting back in 1959, and then ending as far into the early 70s, um, it engaged a nation. It got many people involved in many, many different ways, and we're still feeling the reverberations of that singular goal. We're feeling that reverberations in science and in technology, and how it made us think differently about STEM as a nation: science, technology, engineering, and math. And so it's extraordinary in that regard. And this wasn't a little operational goal, obviously. It was transformative. So, to me, it's the perfect example of how a very clear goal that's publicly stated can be transformative for a whole nation of people. When I talk about this story, I usually use it as a branding example because of how public engagement was built over time as they went through each stage, or as I call it, each milestone of the mission. They went through the Mercury missions, and then they went from Mercury to Gemini, and from Gemini to Apollo, and they brought us along. And in many respects, it created a narrative, a public narrative that allowed people to remain engaged in the journey in terms of reaching this greater destination, this larger goal. And what was important about it is that it built extraordinary momentum. And in building that extraordinary momentum, it survived the death of a president, the president who set the goal. It survived many mishaps and failings along the way because it wasn't just something that was initiated by one organization, NASA. It was something that was really very much a part of the whole nation, part of the national conversation. So when you apply this to strategic planning and thinking about strategic planning for nonprofits, for me, what it does is it helps me understand and see the connection to what a goal in the public space can ultimately do, and how it can ultimately develop a narrative, and how it ultimately can really help engage resources in terms of people around it, in terms of furthering that goal, in terms of making that goal ultimately possible. So 11 years ago, when I started doing strategic planning for Creation in Common, one of the things that I saw a lot in nonprofit organizations' strategic plans was that they were very operationally oriented. And there's nothing wrong with having these kinds of goals of saying, we're really looking at, expanding our individual income by X amount of dollars, or we're trying to build the capabilities of staff. We're implementing a specific program, and this is how we're going to implement it. Operational implementation is extraordinarily important. But one of the things that I saw that was, for me, a major turning point in how I approach strategic planning was how impact was becoming front and center in the conversation in the nonprofit community. How we were being asked by our funders in many respects to be more accountable towards our input, our impact, not just our output. And that the planning tools that we had that were very internal facing weren't really enough. They didn't allow us to ultimately really connect the impact that we were trying to create, our theory of change, to the operational strategies that we were ultimately pursuing. So how do we bring those two things together is what within the public milestone strategy approach is what I'm really trying to get at. So what are the benefits here? Well, the benefits are, like I said, it's about aligning action, those operational strategies to impact. It's about creating that point of engagement for stakeholders to be involved in your effort, both internally and externally. So that people can actually see where you are today and where you're heading into the future, and they understand what the story is behind that ultimately. And then obviously, and like I said earlier, what I think is very important, it's growing visibility through an emerging narrative. It's the idea that if you tell the same story about what you're doing over and over and over and over again, your audience becomes numb to it. They lose their sense of perspective ultimately about that story. So how do we keep them engaged? Well, we open up a window for them into really what's going on, into the challenges that you're facing as you're trying to create change, as you're trying to move the needle on a social issue, or you're trying to impact your audience in different ways. So the emerging narrative becomes really key in order to build momentum toward your goal.